Karima, Sheikh Asim and the team. It's good to be here again. Thank you for taking your time out, for coming. With lots of other things going on, I'm sure people are busy. The weather's not really been good. It's really appreciated. There's a packed room here on both sides. But before I sort of go through and launch into what I want to do, this is a very sensitive topic. So it might feel like today, it might seem a bit relentless, a hammer on a nail. It might seem a bit relentless, like a hammer on a nail. So I do apologize that I don't want it to come across as if it's confrontational, or the other side wants to take a battering, that's why I'm doing it. That's not the reason, really. I'll explain the context of where this presentation is going to be sitting or situating, and then so we get a better idea. So, within the next hour or so, what I hope through some kind of interaction with you guys as well, is go through some sort of key areas that I feel are important when it comes to the LGBTQ plus question, the gender identity question. And so I want to go through, for example, the first slide up there, the context and the climate. So what is this whole discussion, like where does it sit, in what context does it sit? Because it doesn't just happen in a vacuum, right? It doesn't just happen out of nowhere. There are factors and forces, that push it into existence. So I want to look at that. Then I want to look at what are some of the key or major challenges for us as a Muslim community, but of course, obviously anyone who's a faith member of the Abrahamic tradition, what major challenges comes about through the LGBTQ gender question. Then I want to look at what's its genealogy, like where does it come from? Like what are the key ideas that's pushing the LGBTQ sort of agenda? What are the ideas that underpin it? Then I want to look at some of the arguments that are given to justify, let's say for example, homosexuality, and then how we can rebut that argument, or those arguments. And then I want to look at, going forward, and say some things about that. So these 4 or 5 things I want to cover in the next sort of hour. So let's see how that goes. So I apologize if I do rush, but if there's any sort of clarificatory questions, I'll try and stop after each section so then people can ask questions. Otherwise, if we're going to have a big, hopefully quite sufficient time for Q&A. What I have to say as well from the start, because this is just a sort of short presentation, inevitably it's going to be simplistic in a lot of places. It's also going to be quite reductive. So although I might be focusing on sort of perhaps homosexuality a lot, I also mean by that, I guess, transgender as well. But, obviously each area has its nuance. So I don't want people to think, oh, look, he's just lumping them all together when there's nuance there. I'm aware of that. There is nuance, but I can't bring all that out in the session today. Maybe some of that can come out in Q&A. The final thing that I'd like to say is, yes, as someone who's sort of, in recent years, been sort of more, doing more philosophy and theology, I'm aware that this presentation overlooks the pastoral side. There is, with the intellectual dimension, there is always an experiential dimension, and that is just as important. It's not just a matter of, rebutting arguments, intellectual arguments. There is a whole emotional, experiential dimension which requires a different set of, requires a different approach. And I want to be throwing some ideas out. Maybe not everyone will agree, but I think there are some things as a community we're not doing, I feel, properly. So although today might be more intellectual heavy, and I'll explain why that's the case, but we mustn't forget the pastoral side, the experiential side. There's a human side to this issue with members in our community and other communities that we as a community can't overlook. That we can't overlook. And I think we are failing quite miserably in addressing these issues in a cogent way, in a way that makes Islam meaningful to the person who's undergoing that challenge, who's mubtala, he or she is facing challenges that they know are inclinations or feelings or emotions that squarely contradict Islam, their faith, but where's the support? Yeah, where's the support? So there is that dimension which I hope to touch on maybe at the end in one of the parts, and seeing, I'm conscious of time. So okay, so there is a statement which I love, and it's from Sayyiduna Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiyallahu ta'ala an, and Imam al-Qurtubi in his Quranic interpretation mentions this statement under the tafsir, I think, of Surah An-Nazi'ah. There's a verse in there where Allah says, وَمَنْ خَافَ مَقَامَ رَبِّهِ وَنَهَى النَّفْسَ عَنِ الْهَوَى فَإِنَّ الْجَنَّةَ هِيَ الْمَأْوَى. So whoever fears Allah or God, whoever fears Allah, they're standing before God on the Day of Judgment. Whoever genuinely has fear of that, and they restrain their passions or their desires, they restrain it, فَإِنَّ الْجَنَّةَ هِيَ الْمَأْوَى. Allah will guarantee that person paradise. Now under that verse, the statement of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiyallahu ta'ala an was brought by Imam al-Qurtubi, and this is what he says radiyallahu an. So he's saying to a congregation, other Sahabi as well, and students, he says, أَنْتُمْ فِي زَمَانٍ يَقُودُ الْحَقَّ الْهَوَى. You are all in a time when the intellect rules over the passions. Your mind, the intellect, has a grip on, controls your passions and your desires. وَسَيَأْتِي زَمَانٌ يَقُودُ الْهَوَى الْحَقَّ وَنَعُوذُ بِاللَّهِ مِنْ هَذَا الزَّمَانِ. So there will come a time when you'll be in a time when the passions will rule over the intellect, and we seek refuge in God from that time. And I think this statement is so prophetic in that sense, yeah? And it speaks to our time, because we are living in this time, and we're going to see how the LGBT issue at core, because identity is linked to, how you see yourself emotionally and things like that. Your psychology defines you. A lot of that, is to do with emotions and feelings and passions and desires. And so the statement of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiyallahu anhu is very, very apt for our time. Okay, so getting on to business, yeah. So I've got this gadget, this beautiful pen here. So I'm not good with technology, yeah, but I'm going to try and use this one and see how we go. Okay, so I want to go through the context of where is this LGBTQ discussion for Muslim community? Where is it situated in? It's not come out of thin air. Yeah, it's embedded in a context and a climate. And I'm going to just list. I'll just mention them very quickly. Obviously, I can't go through each one at each point because time will just drag. So we're still on from the war on terror. Yeah, the WOT. So we're still in that context from the September 11th days. The residue of that is still felt very strong. So we can't forget that context. Yeah. So war on terror, unfortunately, has been shown really to be a war on, Islam in general. So that's still raging on. We've obviously got the issue of Muslims, the oppression of Muslims and non-Muslims around the world, but where Muslims reside in the, as minorities, and and obviously minorities, but within sort of large diasporas, they're being persecuted. They're being oppressed. So there's some of the geographical regions in which they're being oppressed, or countries, and I've mentioned up there. Some of you are involved in work in trying to sort of help those in distress and in those oppressed places. We've got the Prevent program, which has been a disaster. Doesn't have to go through that. We know what that program is. We know the effect it's had on the Muslim community. Everyone, I think, has been unanimous, Muslim and non-Muslim, that this is just a failure. We also have this idea of the need. There's been quite a strong push for a need for Muslims to reform their faith. So Christianity underwent a reformation. It's about time Islam had one, and people are pushing for that. So things that are considered normative, i.e. orthodox, standard, those are being questioned, asked to be rethought, reinterpreted, and so on. Yeah. So we have that reformation agenda in the backdrop as well. Obviously, we had the rise in Islamophobia, anti-Muslim bigotry and hate. I was just reading, I think, in the newspaper in the morning, the boss of Ryanair was saying Muslims with beards, should be inspected a bit more than everyone else. And it's a bit ironic, anyone who lived through the 80s and 70s till the early 90s would know how the Irish community, I lived in North London my whole life, where there's a massive Irish community. And, the black community and Irish were just seen as like dogs, literally. Subhuman even in places. So it's really, it's sad to see someone like that, who's Irish originally, should know where the Irish community have been persecuted and oppressed even by the British, and how they've been stigmatized, yeah? So we've even just had that recently. So how can someone, a boss of an airline, make a comment like that? So we've got things like that. We've got not only a critique of Islam going on, but a criticism of everything Islamic, to the point where it's not really for intellectual purposes, but a criticism for the sake of criticism, or because Muslims are seen as this kind of problematic, citizen, which they'll just go away sort of problem, yeah? Obviously, we've got an increase in surveillance, which affects everyone. And then there's been a rise in white nationalism, or alt-right nationalism. And there are more, but these are sort of some of the sort of observable, sensible issues in the background in which this LGBTQ discussion takes place. So those are the wider contexts. Specifically, when it comes to the Muslim community, we will see, and many people who are involved in organisations, activists, Muslim scholars, anyone who's at the forefront of, involved in the Islamic da'wah of any shape or form, will feel that, and the Muslim community in general will feel two things from the government. And that is that the Muslim community feels like they're being coerced and forced, bullied into accepting, the dominant paradigm, which is a secular, humanist, liberal paradigm. So if you don't follow, you'll be criminalized. And that's the bottom line. If you don't step in line, you're going to be criminalized. So we've got that aspect on the community. The other aspect of the community, of course, we've got the reform agenda. Look, your Islam is just outmoded for 20th century Britain or wherever it is, Europe. Change your religion. Either follow this reformation program or be marginalized, be ostracized, lose your job, be labeled. You're going to have life difficult. Doors are going to shut. So for me, this is me, I feel something like that is making the Muslim community, and in fact this could be any community if they were bullied in this way, to be politically docile, compliant, non-critical. And yeah, the term westernized, you don't have to use that term, yeah? But the community is to be molded, but they're supposed to be passive. Not to be a critical and politically aware community. Well, why not? So there's that issue. And the LGBTQ issue does play into that issue, because if you don't follow it, you can be criminalized. If you don't allow that to be normative in your religion, then we're going to make sure that, you're not a moderate, your voice we're not going to speak with, we're going to marginalize your voice, we're not going to let you just be a voice on the table, you should be shunned, and so on and so on, yeah? So, the other issue then is we've got something called ideological pressure points. There are places where the establishment want to push where it hurts. Yeah. So they've created pressure points where to push the Muslim community, and I feel these are some of the key areas. You may agree with it, you may not, but I feel these are some of the areas where the pressure points are pressed. So the Muslim community is asked to reassess their aqeedah, their belief. So this idea of normativity, orthodoxy, we shouldn't have this. There's no objective right when it comes to the Islamic religion. So whatever you feel is right for you. There's no normative body of belief or practice. If British Muslims practice Islam a certain way, they think that's normative, then it's normative. If Muslims in Germany or other countries in Europe practice it a certain way and they think that's normative, then it's normative. There's no normative with a capital N. There's no body of orthodoxy with a capital O, yeah? The Islamic Sharia, Islamic law, Sharia law, people, using Sharia as a scare tactic, creeping Sharia. Oh my God, halal food. Next minute, we're going to take over school, we're going to take over Sharia law, is going to operate in school. Oh, you want a prayer room? Next minute you want a Sharia law in my workplace. So everywhere, this creeping Sharia idea. Oh, Islamic finance, it starts like that. You want Islamic financial products. Before you know it, the Shahada flag over Downing Street and whatever it is, yeah? So this kind of scare tactic of creeping Sharia in the UK. You want Sharia arbitration courts. Before you know it, you want all courts to be Sharia courts, yeah? So things like that. Then you've got the hudud. I'm not saying these are not delicate topics and Muslims haven't debated. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying these are the points that are the ideological pressure points for the community that the government has identified that they need to hit. So we've got the hudud. They're considered as the punishment, the penalty codes in Islam. They're considered to be barbaric, medieval, backwards, outmoded, and so on. The gender relations, which concerns us today. Ideas of modesty in Islam. Even Abrahamic religion in general, outmoded, it's out of date. The ideas of gender segregation, that's wrong, it's discriminatory, and so on. So this issue, Islamic dress, covering up the khimar, the headscarf, the niqab, that's under attack. Jihad, equated with violence, terrorism, yeah? The idea of why are Muslims so obsessed with a global community idea? Why aren't you just concerned with where you live in your community? If you're a Muslim living in Britain, the Muslim community in these isles is only your focus. What do you care about Syria, Burma, Palestine, Libya, Kashmir, Pakistan? Why is that your concern? Why is your concern global and internationally minded when your focus should be the isles of this country, yeah? Lastly, the idea of Khilafah, a Dawla al-Islamiyya, an Islamic state. Obviously ISIS, claiming that term. This has become, anyone who subscribes to this idea of a Khilafah, a caliphate, somehow you're an ISIS supporter. You want a medieval backwards government. Government where people just wear turbans and black robes. There's technology, you're going to kick Microsoft out, Apple out, you're not going to have mobile phones, things like that, yeah? So, this idea of a medieval state. So these are some of the ideas. There might be more, we can identify them in the Q&A perhaps, that are the ideological pressure points. These are the contested ideas within the Muslim community. Okay, so that was just sort of I didn't want to put this, these are just sort of some of the ideas I wanted to sort of give you that forms the backdrop. So this is discussion about LGBTQT+ arises in this context of one of the ideological pressure points, that the Islamic ideas on gender are to be challenged, and Muslim community are supposed to change their ideas about it, yeah? Okay, so hopefully this is where I get some interaction now. Okay, so what would be some of the key challenges to the opposed by the LGBTQT agenda? So let's just go through some of these, and then I'll see what you think about them. So I don't know what this guy's doing here. Let's move on. There was a video. Actually, what it is, I had lots of videos to play, but I think what I won't do because of time's sake. We haven't got time to go through them. Okay, so here's the first major challenge from the LGBTQT agenda. Obviously, I mentioned homosexuality a lot in the presentation, but that isn't just restricted to homosexuality. It's just I can't, for reasons of time, keep going through each gender identification on the spectrum. Yeah, I just use homosexuality as a case study. Okay, so the first challenge is homosexuality or LGBTQ, anything on that spectrum, is a moral good. Is a moral good. So one of the first challenges is, according to our faith, remember I'm trying to give this from the Islamic perspective, inversion of morality. So according to the LGBTQ agenda, they have the moral high ground now. So any faith member who challenges their position, you are immoral. You are immoral now. You ought to be criminalized and persecuted. Now, what do you think could be some of the... do you think this could mean for the Muslim community? This particular challenge. What do you think? Or, it doesn't have to be the Muslim community. Obviously, any monotheistic tradition will have pretty much the same problems, implications from this challenge. What do you think could be one of the challenges or entailments? What do you think this could mean if we accept this for the Muslim community? What do you think? Yeah.
Puts you on the back foot on any moral argument.
Yeah, puts us on the back foot, definitely. We're now on the defensive. Whoa, I'm now the immoral person. Whoa, so I've got to step back now. Yeah, it puts us on the defensive, definitely. Yeah.
There's less empathy or sympathy for your own struggles.
Okay, so no one's going to look at... the tables turn now, so suddenly, I'm in the firing line. Okay, good, definitely. Feel free, anyone, to throw your views in. What about if you were now to oppose the moral norm now? What would you be classed as? Yeah, you're a bigot now. You're hate-filled. That could be one of the implications, because you are going against something that's established as good. What else could this mean for the community? What else do you think? Well, we would have to accept something that we consider immoral as moral. So in effect, we'd have to shift our moral goalposts. That's definitely one implication. Well, it looks like as a community, we're going to have to, might have to fight for our right to oppose the paradigm, the moral paradigm. And it looks like it's a losing battle. It looks like it's a losing battle. Okay. The second major challenge. So redefining marriage. So obviously the LGBT community want to claim that marriage is not about the union, the league enshrined in law, or a legal contract between a union of a man and a woman through consent. Rather, it should be anyone. It should be open to any person as long as they come together based on love or something like that. Yeah, any two persons, however they identify, if they come together, that should be considered a marriage. No longer it should be defined as a union between a man and a woman under law. Yeah. So, what do you think that could have? What do you think that could mean then for the Muslim community? This redefinition. Okay. Yeah. It's going to have impact on how we now define marriage. Gay nikah. So same-sex nikah, we'll have to then accept that as being a valid marriage in Sharia law. Yep, definitely. Yeah.
The third consequence probably of every challenge is creating a lot of confusion amongst children.
So confusion amongst children, which is definitely, hopefully when I get time at the end, that's something we need to talk about. Because already obviously we know that the push for the agenda they want is to start early, and they're successful in that. It's not, oh, let's wait till they're teenagers. Let's wait till they're just about walk through the school doors to start pushing the notions that they want to push for the PR machine. Definitely, so it has an impact on how we then explain to children what constitutes a marriage. So redefining types of marriages. What's up? Okay, so the traditional nuclear family will have to be rethought. You know, so definitely that will have to dissolve, and no longer will that be relevant. Because now mum and dad, and mum and mum, dad and dad are interchangeable. They're interchangeable. So it's no longer just mum and dad in terms of legally defining a marriage. Well, another implication would be, just to move on, would be that marriage is being defined by only love, or how two people conceive to express their desire or their emotional relationship with each other. So emotion is now the basis for what defines a marriage. I can't speak for the other monotheistic faiths, but believe it or not, in Islam, that's not the basis of marriage. Don't misunderstand me, I'll explain that. It's a legal contract of offer and acceptance between two parties that mutually come together, but in faith and fulfillment, will play out this marriage contract. Anyone who studies Islamic law will tell you that a legal condition of marriage is not love. That's not a legal condition. So, so the legal conditions are very specific. So, but that doesn't mean that's not the element of a relationship. Of course it is, because the Quran mentions that. But in Islam, we don't define the legal contract of a marriage based on emotion or love. Can you see? So we now have to, it's not about duties and obligations and fulfilling a mutual agreement. It's nothing to do with that now. It's about how you feel about someone else. Okay. Then there's this challenge. So we've got two so far. Third challenge, gender fluidity. That was one of the best pictures I could find. I don't know, I'm sure I could have found something else. But so this idea that however you want to identify yourself as, that is what you are. Yeah? However you identify yourself as, that is how you are. So, if, gender fluidity, plasticity, if today you want to feel like you're a boy, then today you're a boy. If you don't feel like that, you self-identify with another gender, then you self-identify with that gender. You should be allowed to move however you want. However you want. So you can move in and out and be explorative with your gender. So what could this mean for the Muslim community? What could that entail?
Well, the definition of being a man and a woman will change completely. So if you look at marriage, then the woman could become the man.
Definitely. Yeah, there's that binary division of gender that will have to go out the window. That will have to go out the window. So roles defined for men and women on that will have to go as well.
It also affected the laws of hijab.
Yeah, definitely. So for the law, not just Islamic law, obviously any law will have to contend with fluidity. So we obviously, simple cases being, public restrooms, even impacts things like sport now. So what do the law has to cope with that fluidity. So you're right. And then obviously within Islamic context, that impacts on relations, because in Islam, there are certain people, of course, you can see without their external dress. Because, things like that will impact that. Yeah, brilliant. Thanks for what I'm saying.
I was going to say, people introduce problems with having sort of separate bathrooms for male and female.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So there are social practical implications in society that you have to deal with. You know, like I said, the law has to catch up with that. Inheritance laws, that's right. Yeah. I don't want to get into the Islamic inheritance law. Everyone knows about that in fiqh. Again, our mosque spaces, our prayer spaces will have to deal with that fluidity, definitely. Yeah. Oh, sorry, yeah.
Summarise it on a massive ripple in fiqh.
All the muftis here, Maulanas here, man, you lot sort this out. You have to sort this out now. You know, you're right. Huge ripple in fiqh. One of the reform agenda is to revise the fiqh because it's considered to be pre-modern. Just someone at the Sheikh Hassan, I think.
Disregard authority, so you choose what you want to do.
Yeah, I'm going to come to that when we look at the ideas, which is very, very good. That's important. Where these ideas, what are the ideas that underpin these major challenges? Yeah, so the other thing, of course, the implication is that there is this assumption that people can be trapped in the wrong body. Yeah, so we look at that in Islam. There's no such idea as such in theology. But that doesn't mean to put down, you know, like for example, gender dysphoria. That's not to go to put down that, because that is a clinical, those who are specializing in that will know there can be clinical issues here as well, yeah? And then you touched on the point of autonomy, so we're going to come to that. Last one, sexual freedom or sexual liberation. So the LGBTQ agenda is, well, I should have the unrestricted freedom to behave, explore, express myself in terms of my sexuality and my sexual activity. Yeah? So it's not just a hidden preference, it's an expressive behavioral thing. So what could that have? What impact could that have on the Muslim community?
So when it comes to modesty, all of the barriers of modesty will be absolute.
Yeah, definitely traditional etiquette of hayat will have to go out the window. Yeah.
Place your desires at the center of everything.
Yeah, you have to place your inclinations, your shahawat at the center. So it's passion driven, definitely. Obviously public decency, perceptions, things like that. Want to ask it?
Again, back to the idea of the nuclear family breakdown will become absent fathers, mothers, whatever.
Yeah.
Need to care.
Yeah, definitely. Then we've got the other entailment of open sexual activity, so obviously promiscuity, things like that, according to the Islamic perspective. So yeah, there's actually.
There won't be any ontology, there won't be any objective reality.
We're going to look at that. When you reduce it to personal autonomy, it's definitely subjectivity that's important. So and more. So those are at least 4 major challenges facing the Muslim community with this agenda. With this agenda. Okay, so what are the key ideas of underpinning, or where the LGBTQ sort of outlook, what ideas are they like scaffolded? What ideas underpin it? So I think there are 5, but there could be more key enlightenment ideas I think that are important to understand, and then one particular one I'm going to focus on. So the Enlightenment period in Europe was a huge change, changed entire Europe, the whole philosophical, scientific outlook, changed outlook on the world, on human beings. Many ideas came out of the Enlightenment. One key idea that came out is the idea of individualism. Individualism, where the human being, the human subject, the human person is now centered. The human being is now, the person, the individual is now the center. They're not part of a hierarchy anymore. There's no great chain of being. They're not placed by some deity or some god in some grand scheme. There's no system that they're part of. It's just the individual at the center. And the individual liberty and preferences are important, the most important. Yeah? So there are 5 key aspects related to individualism. Rationality. So the idea that human reason can discover everything, and human reason should be basically the tool we use to understand the world, and the only reliable tool. And obviously under that comes the senses, our 5 senses. So the intellect, rationality and empiricism. Human beings can determine what is right and what is wrong using the mind. So there's an optimistic view about human rationality. So human rationality can discover what's right and what's wrong. The second idea is autonomy. So it was mentioned from this side. Autonomy means an individual has the liberty, or not the right, but the individual just has the power to determine what they think is right for them. They can determine what's right for them purely being a subject. They don't need God, they don't need some church, they don't need some imam, they don't need any external higher authority telling them. There can be no externally imposed power telling me how I can be and what I can be. So my self-determination, I need to become who I am. That is paramount. I need to become who I am. If I want to become a cucumber, that's what I'm going to be. What, cucumbers are cool?
That concept in itself, just that one concept, is going to cause so much facade across the community.
I mean,
I'm sitting here right now, I identify as a male, so I'm sitting with the guys. When the Maghrib Adhan goes up, I identify as a woman. So I'm going to go and sit over there and pray with the ladies. How do you control that?
Well, these are the implications sure.
This mess.
So this autonomy idea, is one of the aspects of individualism. Subjectivity, what I feel, how I feel I should be, or what is the case. Who are you to tell me that's not the case? Who are you to tell me I can't be this way? If this is how I make the world, how I want to make the world, based on how I feel. Can you see? So there's no objective reality. There's no objective right and wrong. There's no truth with a capital T, necessarily. There's no morality with a capital M. It's what I take to be the case, yeah? Lastly, freedom. So, sort of a person's civil liberties. The freedom to believe what I want, do what I want, say what I want, think what I want, be what I want, follow what I want. So these freedoms, personal freedoms. And lastly, something called authenticity. This idea that I have to be, how I can truly be is defined by me. I have to be true to myself. These are sound bites in our culture. Follow your heart, be what you want to be, or how you want to be. Whatever, if that's what you truly believe in yourself, then follow that and be that. So each person is different. Let each person follow their own path in their own way, defined by themselves. So these are some of the key ideas that underpin the LGBTQ movement. So from rationality and autonomy, you have to throw out things like religious authority. Have to throw that out the window. Autonomy, I decide what I want and how I want to be. So what is a religion to tell me how I'm supposed to be? And I'm only limited by my own subjective horizons. I'm only limited by my own thinking horizons and things like that. So those are some of the key ideas. Key aspects of one idea, which is individualism underpinning the LGBT agenda. Okay, so just very quickly, the crux of it for Muslims is, are human beings the ultimate legal and moral authority? And within Islamic tradition, the answer is no. Human beings are not the ultimate moral and legal authority. So human beings are not the source of what's right and wrong, and they're not the source of regulating human life. So I'm not going to rehearse all the theological arguments given by that, but one major theological tradition says that We're human, we're finite, we're limited. You know, we have no way of knowing. We don't have the cognitive power to enable us to have a legislation that could regulate human life from all aspects. We just don't have that cognitive power. The other argument is that objective right and wrong doesn't exist out there in the world. Objective right and wrong comes from God and His commandments, so it has to come from something external to the world. So there are no moral facts out there for you to sense. Like, you can sense something being bitter and sweet, but you can't. There's nothing out there like bitter and sweet that's right and wrong. If there was, then everyone would have sensed the same rightness and wrongness and so on. And so there's huge sort of theological, metaphysical discussions about that. So that's the core theological, philosophical discussion. Can human beings determine what's right and wrong? And can human beings determine how best to live their lives? So law or morality? And obviously the Islamic position is no. Right, so any questions on what I've said so far? Anything that, because I think we're about halfway through. So before I go on to, sort of going through some arguments, general arguments people give to in favour of the LGBT position. Usually I get an ah with that picture, yeah? But, all right, so let's get on to some arguments which you may have come across yourselves, where some people give for justifying the LGBTQT plus viewpoint, their agenda. So I'll race through some of them. So one argument is, you may have come across, is, homosexuality is found in nature. So what's wrong with that? So some responses for that is, well, there's no scientific consensus on that at all. Yeah, I think anyone in the biological sciences would know, and they can tell us better. There might be some studies, but there are also loads of studies that negate it. The point is, there's no scientific consensus on the issue. But anyway, even if it is found in nature, so what? Human beings don't take nature as a moral paradigm. That's called the appeal to nature fallacy, or the naturalistic fallacy. Just because something might be the way it is out there, it doesn't say that it's something you ought to follow. You can't get that ought from the is, yeah? That Hume says. So animal behavior is not a guide for human behavior. And obviously in Islam, al-tabi'ah, nature, is not a source of law. It's not a source of law. The sources of law, the agreed sources of law, are the Quran, Hadith, Ijma', Qiyas. So Quran, Hadith, the Ijma' of the Sahaba, because that's agreed by everyone, and analogy, legal analogy. These are the usul, the sources of law. Nature isn't a source of law. We don't look to nature and say, we can say it's halal and haram now based on what animals do. So for Muslims anyway, anyone who studies jurisprudence will know, no human community is a source of law. No person other than the Prophet is a source of law. So nature is not a source of law either. So, okay, so those are some responses there. Oh, sorry.
Do you have an example in nature that animals killing their children?
Yeah, which one is it? I think that's which spider is it, or which insect is it that after copulating kills its spouse?
Black widow.
Damn, the black widow. Imagine if that was a moral paradigm. We'll have to, a lot of homicide. But so we're not. The point is this: when on a secular, humanist, subjectivist, liberal paradigm, how do you decide what from nature you're going to take and what you're not going to take? What's what we call the exclusion criteria? So let's just say, that's a ridiculous example, black widow. All right, but give me a criteria to decide. Do I follow baboons? What, hyenas? I mean, which animal kingdom, which species do we follow? Can you see? Or do we take as a moral norm? You need to have a criteria to decide that. You can't just say, we find it in nature. Well, you've got to give me a criteria now. What are you deciding and what are you leaving? Yeah? So that is a huge problem on that LGBTQT. All right, so people are born transgender, people are born bisexual, people are born homosexual. So if they're born, who are you to tell them that they're not that way? Can you see? So that's one argument. Again, though, where is the scientific and empirical evidence to say that, you know, people are born this way? Because it works both ways. If someone says, "Look, let's say I'm born homosexual," someone says, "Therefore, homosexuality is morally okay." What's your problem? Well, someone can say the opposite and say, "Well, I'm born heterosexual, so it's morally okay for me to be heterosexual." What's your problem? Why are you imposing your agenda on my agenda? Can you see? So we're an impasse now. Who decides who's right, who's wrong? It just becomes... But what's happening, though, is obviously the LGBTQ agenda is being asserted. Can you see? It's being asserted. And then if you're against it, then you should be criminalised. So you can't just privilege one person's view, you know, arbitrarily. Right, so, we'd have to say if you're born that way, some of it must be genetic. Well, there's nothing to suggest that they're genetic. And then people have got studies on twins, because twins share the same genetics. How come they have different orientations or inclinations? Yeah.
How would they,
Oh.
how would they be able to accept their agenda when there has been no established scientific consensus? How did they get that confidence to come this far?
Oh, that's more like a sociological, political question now. I mean, it depends how you want to analyse it, isn't it? Those who, any view is always privileged, I guess, when the dominant class can assert its agenda. It could be a whole host of factors, the need to push back on religion. Because remember the secular origins, the humanist origins, the liberal origins of the LGBTQ agenda, as I mentioned, because that paradigm is considered to be the norm, so anything else, marginalised and so on. And that's just one explanation, but there are obviously others. Yeah.
It's also the fact that it came into a void of religion and sacred belief of any sort. So there's a strong correlation between support for homosexuality and secularism, for instance. So there's much more support in this country than there is in the States, for example, where people are more religious.
You're right, absolutely.
So we have this amazing void which needs to be
filled. Yeah.
And we don't have any arguments now to fight back.
We also have to remember this is a development. The LGBTQ agenda didn't just arise out of just, like, for example, the last 5 years. Obviously, we've got the 1960s, which was a crucial time, when the sexual revolution, that ushered in. So we have developments. Then we have the legislative phase, they call. So you have the sociological phase, the ushering a new idea of how to be sexually and how to behave sexually from the 1960s. That was groundbreaking as a paradigm shift. Moved away from traditional religious, post-war, lingering, residual Christian ideas about the family. Then you went into the legislative phase and other phases. So we've come to where we are through phases. It didn't just suddenly emerge out of nowhere. So there is historical development. Yeah.
I just want to make one more quick point, which I think is really important for our young people, that you can't argue back with rationality. The only way we can push back is with sacred beliefs.
Sure, okay, yeah.
Get to a point where you lose the argument and you just can't keep arguing. It has to be up to your belief and your aqidah.
I think so. I think for me, in the end, the upshot is, in case anyone who leaves, I don't know what the upshot is. The intellectual arguments, I think, the LGBTQ agenda, I think they've lost the intellectual argument. Me personally, I don't think that's what they're riding on anymore, because these arguments are flimsy, at best, in my opinion. Anyone who studies some basic critical thinking, some logic and philosophy will see that these are not very strong arguments. But I don't think the battleground necessarily is there. The reason why we're having it today is just so we know what the counter-arguments are, to be armed and on guard. Very quickly, Allah made people gay. That is obviously a statement coming still from the community. But what are some of the responses? We would say, well, where from Scripture, where from the Quran and Hadith says that Allah made someone like this? Where? We would like to see it when Allah always talks about pairs. Talks about Adam.
Linked to that, could you also make the argument that people could take criminal behaviour and be like, well, Allah made me a thief?
Yeah, definitely, which is definitely one of the arguments. Because what happens, the danger is when you anchor something in nature, human nature, someone is always going to say, well, I'm built this way. I'm built to have this orientation. The question now is, whose orientation do you privilege? Why don't we privilege someone who has a disordered inclination and say, well, they're claiming it's their nature to have certain inclination to certain types of people, animals, objects, whatever it might be. Why are you discounting, excluding because they're saying it's human nature. So it's arbitrary. It's arbitrary when you take a secular, subjectivist, humanist or liberist paradigm. So Allah made you that way. How? Think of the logic. How can Allah make you this way and then punish you? What the argument is saying is that Allah made me other than the way He wants me to be, and then He's going to punish me for it. So He made me gay, but He doesn't want me to be like that, and then He's going to punish me for something that's not my fault. I can't see anywhere in the Quran or Hadith, and then someone can show me where that logic exists. I just don't. If someone can find it, we can have a discussion about it. So, yeah.
If somebody came back and said that actually it does exist, where, for example, relations outside marriage are haram,
Yeah.
but human beings do have those inclinations.
Yeah, well, the issue is this. Our scholars never said if you have SSA, so same-sex attraction, you're gay. They never ever said that, because homosexuality, gayness is a construct that came later. The attraction is an unlawful attraction, just like coveting someone else who you're not supposed to covet, for example. If that desire comes in you, when the moment you act on that desire, then you're falling into the realms of the law now is going to have to intervene. And so it's not that if you have the same-sex attraction, suddenly, I'm now gay. That equivalency, I think, is faulty. There are other things that have to go on before one identify or one label someone as a homosexual. Because, just to make a pastoral point, Allah could be testing that person with that shahwa to bring them closer to Him. Now, your logic and my logic is like, how can that be? But who are you? Who am I to say that people should only be tested in the same way? What, should everyone only be tested with money? Does Allah draw people closer with only through money? Testing with money, or only through testing them through crime? Only through testing them through... Allah tests who He wants to bring near to Him in unfathomable ways for us. So if that person is experiencing that, then that is an ibtila, a test that Allah has put them on. The question now is, have they got the regenerative resources, the tazkiyah, tarbiyah resources to overcome that? They may not even overcome it throughout their whole life. They may not. That may be a lifelong mujahada. That might be their jihad. Because in the hadith we know that, isn't it? That it's a sahih hadith. Al-mujahid man jahada nafsahu fi ta'atillah. The mujahid, the one who struggles in the way of Allah, is someone who is struggling against their own selves, which can come in all, and the desires in all forms. So it could be that they're having that attraction, which is not what Allah's going to judge them on necessarily, but rather it's, has my servant taken the resources that my Prophet has shown them and the Sahaba to combat that attraction? And this is where we need to mature up as a community. And not label people with something that they ought not to be labelled with. That's their mujahada, by the way. That's their struggle. It may take them through their life, just like many people struggle with food, drugs, lots of things. So that was just a point I wanted to make, that the attraction could be there. That attraction is there and can't be taken out necessarily, but that becomes the person's struggle. But that doesn't mean Allah made him homosexual. Can you see? The attraction Allah put in every human being. If it just happened to be a disordered attraction, then that is something that they have to combat. And that's their mujahada, that's their struggle. Moving on quickly, I know I was rushing. The other argument is, but me being on the LGBTQ plus spectrum is not harming anyone. Not necessarily, because the agenda is to publicly promote, endorse, and celebrate, which means changing public perceptions, right? It's not just, it's all behind closed doors. But even if it was behind closed doors, it doesn't make it morally right. Because in Islam, we don't have this idea that just because something is socially benign, is morally okay. We don't have a consequentialist view of ethics like that. Even if no one was harmed, taking recreational drugs, for example. Yeah, someone just blazing a zoot in their house and no one was being affected, still doesn't make it right. It still doesn't make it right. So just because something's socially benign, it doesn't make it right in Islam. So whether it's public or private, in terms of morality, is neither here nor there within the Islamic perspective. And yes, it does harm others. Some of the points were mentioned here: is disrupting the family unit, rupturing the traditional family structure. Obviously there is a public health issue as well, because members of the LGBTQ plus community, especially homosexual, statistically, because of the open sexual activity, has made them prone to, having more sexually transmitted diseases. So that is a public health issue now. So the government has to intervene. There's costs in there. It comes from the budget, etc., etc. So we can't just say it's benign when it's not benign at all. And then there are also other collateral effects. So increase in sexual freedom has meant increase in pornography, increase in sexualized culture. So that we call that the collateral effect. So it's not benign, harmless. If two people are just, what's your problem? It's not affecting society. It clearly is. Consenting adults, no legal system just uses consent as a basis of morality or law. Even if two adults are consenting, it doesn't mean it's right, ever. We know in Islamic law, those of us that are scholars here in Islamic law will tell you, just because two people in the Sharia consent to something doesn't make that mashru'. It doesn't make it valid according to the Sharia. You and I can consent to selling unlawful goods. It doesn't mean it's okay. Same in British law. You can't just consensually enter into a contract. We can't just sell arms with each other just as it's consensual. The law isn't going to allow you. So no legal system is based purely on something being consensual. So that's not really an argument, a strong argument. And the question then arises then on a secular, humanist, subjectivist, liberal, LGBTQ agenda, whose consensual consent is acceptable and privileged and whose is not. Whose is and whose is not. Okay, very quickly, I think I've got 15 minutes, I need to race through. What's the Islamic view on gender? Very, very, very quickly. Gender is defined by Allah. So in the Islamic tradition, Allah defines a gender of a person. Human beings do not have the autonomy to define the gender for themselves. Gender is primarily linked to biology and not psychology. So just how you feel doesn't define how you can be, within the Islamic tradition. Psychology must conform to the commandments of Allah. Because as in our tradition, the Prophet says, لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى يكون هواه تبعا لما جئت به. So in the 42nd hadith, I think Arba'een of Imam al-Nawawi, the hadith says that none of you has complete belief until their desires and inclinations and emotions conform with everything that I brought. So not only is our thinking and ideas have to conform to Islam, but our behavior, our attitudes, and our emotions and feelings have to conform to Islam. That way we get that holistic shakhsiyah, we get that congruent personality, because there's a single source for our thoughts and our behavior. Male and female are not dispensable categories. We can't just change them how we want. Obviously, there is some fixity within Islamic tradition on that. So there is some correlation between gender roles within Islamic law and biology. I mean, that's obvious. Certain things like breastfeeding, certain things like that are linked to biology. So making stuff like that fluid, I don't know how we're going to do that. Make biology fluid. Desires are natural in Islam. There's nothing wrong in having desires. The question is then, what is the desire oriented towards? And whether that desire is fulfilled in a Sharia congruent way or a Sharia incongruent way. So desires are natural, but we act out our desires through choice. We act out our desires through choice.
You say that gender is not flexible category in the Sharia.
If it's primarily anchored in biology.
But somebody could say, for example, that if we find
that's right.
For men who don't have desires for women,
yeah.
and the rules of hijab are flexible for such people. So could that clear indications of gender fluidity in some respects. And of course, in the hadith, we find examples of
Yeah.
So that's like a third gender, like or something. How would you fit that?
We will have to see how pre-modern jurists, the categories that they understood from the Quran, mentioned hadith, whether they correlate and how they correlate.
Is that going to be enough though? Because
how they correlate to homosexuality.
you need to have knowledge of biology as well. You only need to know about stuff as well.
Definitely.
Most of these people exist in places like India or Indonesia or something
Yeah.
like that. In medieval Arabia and Europe,
Yeah.
they didn't exist.
Yeah.
If they did exist, then the jurists focus on these things. Because if they didn't,
But you see, these categories, which are very, quite detailed in law, is it the same as what we're talking about here, an autonomous, someone identifies how they want to, based on autonomy, authenticity, things like that.
definitely not. But when it comes to gender fluidity, so you could say.
But gender fluidity is defined a certain way, you see. If you want to say gender spectrum, I get that. But gender fluidity is when, can that person, let's say khuntha, whatever it might be, that's right. So can he just say, well, now, I don't want to be this. And then I go back to that. So the question is, when we say fluidity, though, the fluidity here is through choice. That's right. I know I don't want to open up the legal discussion, but that is so important, and I wish maybe that could be something we can address in a separate session, because it needs that time. Where there's been ambiguity is very important to point out. But I'm worried about, let's not jump and make the correlations so quick. Okay, so any questions on that before we I want to move on. I haven't got time for that. Strategies moving forward. So any points on just the arguments that were mentioned there very quickly before I kind of just close it with this section now. Okay, so going forward, what strategies should we be using? We could be using it as a community. Some strategies I think we should avoid quite obviously is, I think we ought not to enter this reformation game where we ought to reform Islam so we can accommodate that LGBTQ plus agenda. I don't think that's the way we should be going, because of it going squarely against Islamic theology and Islamic ideas. So obviously that will mean maybe we ought not to endorse, queer theology or queer tafsir, things like that. So that I don't think we should go. That's quite plain. I think that just follows an entailment from what I've just been mentioning before. I think those of us in academia, we ought to be quite firm in our stance that, people are going to take academia in a direction that becomes LGBTQ plus friendly, allowing that as a legitimate Islamic voice amongst other voices with Muslim voices. We'll get that. Question is, as a community, I think we ought not to do that, because that's allowing the agenda to, that's just giving fuel to the agenda, and I don't think we want to do that. That would be inconsistent, I think, if we did that. Obviously, that doesn't mean where we can critically open up and look at how jurists have analysed things. I'm not saying not to do that. But not on the basis of supporting an agenda, but it's purely out of finding the truth. And obviously we live now in a time where our jurists need to think about the realities of our time, whether they're the same realities. I get all that. Looking at the manat al-hukm, because we know that the reality behind a ruling, if that changes, the ruling changes. We know that there's nothing new about that. So I'm all for that, definitely. We need to have a rigour in how we're analysing our tradition. I don't think we should adopt the agenda as a common platform. That's my view. Again, I think we should always articulate our agenda on our own terms, as a sui generis agenda, as an agenda defined by us, with our own nomenclature, our own terms, our own premises, and our agenda ought to be defined by us, I think. I feel we need to have an iron back, a steel in our back when it comes to that. That's not to say that where we see oppression, we don't condemn it. Where we see people being attacked, we don't condemn it. Where there's bigotry, where it shouldn't be, we don't condemn it. Of course we do. But I think on pragmatic grounds, to share a platform, I just don't think that's the most nuanced way we ought to go about it. So those are three things. So what should we adopt doing what we're doing today? articulating an Islamic case, so having sessions like this to strengthen confidence in the community about Islam's position and why society should embrace Islam's position. We believe we have the global message, a universal message, and we ought to share that with the community. Get other insights from the community, have a reciprocal discussion, why not? So that intellectual part to, address where the ideological pressures are being created by the government and those agencies and institutions and think tanks that are supporting the government agenda. So articulate the Islamic normative position. Obviously the pastoral side, some people say we should go forward with this, separate identity from behavior. Fair enough, even though we might deny homosexuality or anything on the LGBTQ plus agenda spectrum, but we must have a compassionate and embracing and comforting approach. We have to understand that those who are undergoing struggles on this spectrum shouldn't be ostracized. The door should not be slammed on them, especially mosque doors. They should be welcomed in with support. If they don't go to our mosques, they can go somewhere else. That's an immature way to deal with the issue. We need to have confidentiality. I'll come to the question. We need to have confidentiality when people come with their concerns. We have a humanizing discourse towards those under the struggles on that spectrum. Be comforting. Give them a message of there being regeneration and maghfirah and rahmah of Allah. Why can't anyone attain the nearness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through any type of struggle? As I was mentioning earlier, just because it's something you don't think is all right, or I don't think is, that's just me and my, ego, arrogance, lack of compassion, idiocy. Everyone has their own struggles. Yes, Omar.
So the question I was going to ask was, how would you deal with somebody who is sort of, in a sense, accepting of you sort of gay or homosexual, or for example, the example I was going to give was a transsexual comes to the mosque.
Okay.
For example, if they was to identify as a woman, but then obviously they couldn't get out inside the women's side of the mosque, how do you deal with that without sort of
Well, that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. We've got huge challenges. There's the legal side, because it could be that if you exclude someone, they could report acts of discrimination. Merely being excluded from a certain place, so that we need to address. The other thing is that, of course, if that person identifies as a Muslim as well, then until and otherwise, they're a member of the Muslim community. Until and otherwise, we have evidence from them or whatever it might be, that they've got to be welcomed, and then support discussion and find out what can that person or individual or group of individuals, are they open to seeing what Islam says? Have they understood really what Islam says on this issue? Believe it or not, some people, I know it might sound very clear cut to us, but some people still don't know. Some people still don't know. So that part of that tarbiyah, that education needs to be there. And our mosques, how they adopt that strategy, obviously to minimize the ripple effect on the congregation, they need to think about that. And this is what I'm saying. I don't have all the answers. I haven't ironed out. But obviously lots of imams and committees and boards are discussing how to thrash out a practical approach going forward on that. These are just two general points. But I want to end with this. And I think this is a wider point. And we can take this up in the Q&A, this position, how can we take practical steps? It doesn't matter ultimately, as Muslims, for me, that we're living in a paradigm that is not an Islamic paradigm. That's quite obvious for everyone. Yeah. Ultimately, we are fish out of water. Ultimately, as Muslims, we are fish out of water. That's not, that's not a point of confusion. We're fish out of water because the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us to be in the world, and if we take the idea of fitrah to be the acknowledgement that there is a creator, and if we take fitrah to be Islam, the acknowledgement that there is a creator, then the creator will give us a system to enable us to realize and activate this fitrah. So we were created with a certain nature, a disposition to understand our Creator, and then our Creator has given us a package of systems by which to live our life so we can fulfill. Maybe when we have Q&A after Salah, we can, unless, I don't know what...
يا الله اسقينا بالماء